We're not going back to castles or crowns tonight. No knights in gleaming armor, no royal decrees echoing through marble halls. Instead, we're stepping off the edge of the map to the mud, the smoke, and the quiet resilience of the medieval peasant. The ones history forgot, but the land never did. These were people who never rode horses, never held swords, never signed treaties. They carried hoes, not halberds. Their battles weren't won on fields of glory, but in fields of riot, frost, famine, and fatigue, with calloused hands and quiet resolve. No one wrote songs about them. No one carved their names in stone. They lived, worked, loved, and died in the same handful of acres often, no more than 60 steps from cradle to grave. If this kind of slow, grounded history brings you peace, if you find comfort in the hum of an unseen hearth and the weight of an unrecorded life, then stay a while. Like or subscribe only if it truly soothes you. And if you feel moved, tell me where you are and what hour it is for you. There's something strangely beautiful about knowing others are drifting off to the same quiet tale, scattered across time zones but united in stillness. So dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft, distant drone. Settle in, breathe. Let's begin where the world ends, at the edge of the forest, in a valley so small it never earned a name. Maybe it once did, but the wind has long since scattered the syllables. This place exists in the blank spaces between the inked lines of ancient maps, a soft fold in the earth, far enough from roads, records, or royal notice to be forgotten before it was ever found. You've never seen a map. You wouldn't recognize one if you held it. For you, the world begins at your door and ends where the trees swallow the light. The forest isn't romantic, it's ancient, watchful, dense with roots that seem to coil tighter when your back is turned. It tolerates your presence, barely. The fields, worked until your hands bleed, then worked again. Somewhere north flows a river you've only heard whispers of it, spoken in the same hushed awe reserved for saints or miracles. It might as well be legend. This is where you were born. This is where you'll be buried. And in between long days, short nights, a rhythm carved by sun and ache, not by clocks or calendars. The homes lean into the wind like they've given up arguing with it. Walls of wattle and daub mud, straw, sticks woven tight and patched with whatever the last storm left behind. Roofs sag under the weight of time and rain, always leaking in spots just out of reach. The air smells of wet wool, wood smoke, damp earth, and the sour temps of livestock. After a while, you stop noticing. It's just the smell of being alive. The road in isn't really a road, just twin ruts carved by ox carts, deep enough to pool rainwater and breed mosquitoes. No noble has passed this way in memory. Time here isn't marked by bells unless the wind carries the chapel chime from the next village over. Otherwise, you read the sky, you feel the sun on your neck. You know it's midday when your spine begins to throb. There are a dozen families, maybe fewer. Everyone knows everyone and everyone's secrets. But no one speaks unless they must. Conflict is softened with shared bread, a shrug, silence. Leadership isn't claimed. It's assumed by whoever's roof still stands and whose goat hasn't gone lame. That's Tom. He once spoke to a monk and now quotes scripture like it's his own wisdom. No one corrects him. His fence holds. That's credential enough. Nothing is written down. Boundaries aren't lines on paper, but landmarks. Past the lightning-struck elm, where the ground turns marshy, disputes are settled with a loaf passed back and forth until pride gives way to hunger. There's no school, no tavern, no inn. A stranger's arrival sends ripples through the village for weeks. Where did they come from? Do they carry fever? Do they smell of salt, like the sea? Outsiders are equal parts wonder and warning, and almost no one leaves. Not because there's no longing, but because the world beyond the next hill doesn't belong to you. You've heard of towns with stone houses 2 stories high, streets that don't turn to sludge in rain. But those are tales, like women who fly or beasts that speak. Why mourn a world you've never touched? Travel isn't adventure, it's risk. The forest teems with wolves and men who've slipped through society's cracks. Roads are mud-choked, unnamed, unmarked. Directions are folklore. Go until you see the pine that leans like a drunkard, then left past the rock shaped like a sleeping boar. One wrong turn, and you vanish into the green. No rescue comes. No one even knows you're gone until feast day, when your absence is noted with a shrug. And even if you made it to another village, what then? You speak a dialect they might not understand. You carry no coin. You own nothing but the clothes on your back and the dirt under your nails. Hospitality is a luxury when food is scarce and beds are shared. You might be turned away or worse, so you stay. Not from fear, exactly, though fear is a faithful companion. You stay because there's barley to dry, fences to mend, a niece to watch while her mother tends the sick. You stay because home, for all its leaks and drafts, is the only place that knows your name. You wake with the light. You sleep when the fire dims. You work in between. It isn't grand, it isn't remembered, but it is life, and in its quiet repetition, there's a kind of peace. News of kings, wars, commits it, drifts in like fog, thin and formless after passing through too many mouths. A dying monarch might as well be a ghost story. Time here isn't counted in years, but in harvests, the wet one, the dry one, the black year when the rye rotted in the field, and even old Marjorie stopped scowling for a week once a year. The Lord's steward comes. He takes grain, asks questions, scribbles in a book you can't read. You answer carefully, never offering more than asked. You've never met the king. You're not even sure what he does, but you say his name in your prayers, just in case heaven keeps records. Most things here don't change, and when they do, it's rarely for the better. Still, the hearth glows, the roof holds mostly, the cottage smells of stew and smoke, and something stubbornly like home. And tomorrow, the sun will rise over the same hills. For now, that's enough. In your lifetime, you'll walk hundreds of miles, but nearly all of them in circles. Most medieval peasants never strayed more than 5 miles from their birthplace. Not from lack of courage or curiosity, but because the world beyond didn't welcome them. Boots were a luxury, maps a myth, purpose. You had plenty, just not beyond your fence line. You knew every stump on the path to the well. You could read the mud like a book whose cow had passed, which child ran home late. Beyond that, it was theory. The next village might be 5 miles away, but it felt like another realm. You knew their gossip about stolen goats and snoring priests, but you'd never seen their chapel. Travel was dangerous, not in the thrilling way, but in the slow, grinding way, exposure, starvation, bandits who saw your patched cloak and assumed you had something worth taking. Confidence offered no shield, and if you got lost, no one came looking. You could disappear into the bracken like mist, and your name would fade before your bones did. Even practicality anchored you. Who would feed the chickens? Who'd watch the field while you were gone? The steward wouldn't care that you were exploring. Your obligations didn't pause for wonder. Still, sometimes people left, the desperate, the reckless. A young man chasing rumors of mercenary pay or holy wars. Some came back with scars and stories. Most didn't return at all. And when they vanished, the village didn't mourn loudly. They just said, "He went beyond the trees," as if that explained everything. For those who stayed, life was small but known. You weren't lonely. You shared your days with kin, neighbors, animals, and the land itself. There was comfort in the rhythm, the same complaints, the same chores, the same slant of afternoon light through the thatch. You didn't need to taste cinnamon to know sweetness. You didn't need stone towers to feel awe. Love, sorrow, boredom, hope, they bloomed just as vividly here, in the mud and mist. As your joints stiffened and your children grew taller than the fence posts, the dream of travel didn't die with regret. Some were meant to roam. You were meant to root. Your home wasn't built, it was negotiated. A truce between shelter and storm, between what you needed and what the earth begrudgingly gave. No blueprint, no architect, just mud, wood, and will. You start with rough-hewn timbers, bent and knotted from trees your grandfather felled. You weave thin branches between them, wattle, then slap on daub, mud, straw, manure, water. It cracks in summer, sloughs off in winter. You patch it again. Again, the roof is thatch golden when fresh, gray, and frayed by the next season. Birds nest in it. Rain finds its way through. You place buckets where the leaks land and pretend you meant to design it that way. The floor is dirt, packed by years of feet and spills. It softens in rain, hardens in frost. You scatter rushes to cover it, but they rot into the earth, becoming part of the ground itself. Windows. Just holes with shutters that never quite close. No glass, too rare, too fragile. The wind slips in. So do the chickens. The door hangs crooked from frost heave, latched with a wooden peg knot to keep thieves out. There's nothing to steal, but to keep the goats in. Inside, one room, maybe two, if someone tacked on a lean-to. Here, you sleep, eat, argue, mend, birth, grieve. The hearth smolders in the center smoke, curling up through a hole in the roof, staining the beams black. The air is always warm, always damp, always smelling of stew, reheated one too many times. Furniture is sparse, a table, a bench, maybe a chest passed down through a lucky marriage. Beds are straw-stuffed frames, shared, creaking. Blankets are heavy wool, never quite dry. Garlic, onions, and dried herbs hang from the rafters. In lean winters, you can smell your dwindling stores just by looking up. Animals live among you, cow in the corner, chickens underfoot. Their noises fade into the background, like wind in the thatch or the slow groan of walls settling. Nothing is level. Nothing is perfect. Every spring you swear you'll fix the back wall. Every autumn it's still leaning. This house wasn't built to last centuries. It was built to survive the next storm, and yet it's home. You know where the cold sneaks in and how to block it with a sack. You know which beam holds the pot, which one groans if you stand beneath it. You know how the light falls across the floor at dusk, and where the dog curls to sleep, strangers see poverty. You see a roof that hasn't collapsed. Victory, a fire still burning at dawn. Blessing, a dry corner, worth more than silver. And when you lie down at night, surrounded by snores, silence, smoke, and straw, you feel it not pride, but presence. This space bends, leaks, shifts, but it holds. And so have you. For the medieval peasant, food wasn't cuisine. It wasn't colorful or varied or even reliably hot. It was a daily puzzle solved with the same few pieces: hunger, hope, and a pot that never emptied. Your kitchen is a corner by the hearth. No pantry, no spice jars, no sunny windowsill of herbs. Just a cauldron, a fire, and whatever hasn't spoiled. At the heart of nearly every meal is pottage eternal stew, simmering for days, weeks, sometimes months. You add cabbage when it's fresh, leeks when they sprout, barley when the bin isn't empty. On rare days, a scrap of bacon or a dried pea. You skim what you need at supper, add water in the morning, and pray nothing grows in it overnight. It's never new, never finished. Just there, like the earth, like the ache in your hands, like the quiet certainty that tomorrow you'll do it all again. Because that's the truth of it. Life wasn't about legacy. It was about showing up, day after day, in the mud, in the cold, in the quiet. And somehow, in all that repetition, finding a kind of dignity, a kind of peace, not the peace of ease, but the peace of endurance, the peace of knowing you built something that held, however imperfectly. And so did you. Legumes were your lifeline: dried peas, fava beans, lentils if the harvest had spared any. In winter, you relied on stores laid down during better days, garlic or onions, if fortune smiled. And if you were truly blessed, a scrap of salted pork might find its way into the pot. More often, just the bone. Even that was treasure. You'd boil it for days, scraping every last whisper of flavor from its marrow, praying it remembered what meat once tasted like. The flavor of your pottage was never bold, just earthy, thin, gray. Less a taste than a temperature. You didn't eat it for joy. You ate it because it was what existed between hunger and survival. A warm bowl at dusk wasn't comforted. Wiped, scraped, maybe rinsed, but never truly scrubbed. Why waste water? The next batch simply absorbed the ghosts of the last. There was no spice to disguise the dullness, no vinegar to lift it, just the slow, steady sameness of boiled history. Bread was your other anchor, but not the soft, golden loaves of fantasy. Yours was dark, dense, and hard enough to double as a weapon if left out overnight. Made from rye, barley, or oats, never wheat. That soft, white grain belonged to lords and abbots. Your loaves barely rose. They crumbled in your hands, but they filled your belly and gave you something to soak in the stew. In desperate times, bread wasn't even flour. It was chaff, pea husks, or the gritty sweepings from the miller's floor. In famine, people ground the inner bark of trees, elm, ash, birchand, mixed it with what little grain remained. The result was bitter, heavy, barely digestible, but it kept you breathing, technically. When flour vanished entirely, you used trencher-thick slices of stale bread as plates. You soaked them in stew, then ate them at the end of the meal, or handed them down to someone lower in the household. Bread hierarchy in its rawest form. Protein, a rare guest. You didn't slaughter your animals, they were your future. Cows gave milk. Chickens laid eggs. You kept them alive as long as you could. But when death came through illness, accident, or necessity, used every part. Meat, fat, organs, blood for black pudding, bones for weeks of broth, even the head for soup. Nothing was wasted. Waste was death deferred. Pork was the closest thing to luxury when available. Pigs were efficient, hardy, and their salted fat could turn a bland gruel into something almost savory. But slaughtering one meant planning for weeks, salting, smoking, boiling, storing. A whole pig wasn't a feast, it was a season of labor, fishing. Only if you lived near water, and even then, most rivers and lakes belonged to the Lord. Cast a line without permission, and you might lose more than your catch. When you did fish, it was eels, minnows, anything that wouldn't spoil by sundown. Salted herring, if you could trade for it, was pure gold. The church shaped your plate to no meat on Fridays, no meat during Lent. So you turned to fish or invented loopholes. Beaver tails, for instance, were declared fish by clever theologians, not because they swam, but because they needed to eat. And no one argued. Hunger has a way of quieting doctrine. Milk was common, but fragile. It soured fast. So you turned it into butter or cheese. Butter was a luxury, used drop by drop. Cheese was hard, sharp, dry sometimes, mold-filled. You cut away the worst and hoped your gut was stronger than the rot. Sour milk still went into the pot. Rancid butter still spread on bread. Survival didn't wait for perfection. As for drink water was risky. Upstream neighbors, livestock, runoff. You never knew what lurked in the stream. So you drank ale. Not strong ale, small beer, weak, cloudy, barely alcoholic, brewed at home, drunk by everyone, even children. Just enough alcohol to kill germs and dull the edges of thirst. If you had apples or pears, you made cider. Wine, for priests and nobles. Mead, a dream. Milk, reserved for the sick or very young. Otherwise, it was ale at dawn, ale at noon, ale at dusk, helping you forget that tomorrow's meal would taste just like today's. Vegetables formed the bulk of your diet. Cabbage, leeks, onions, garlic, turnips, carrots, not the orange kind. Medieval carrots were white, purple, sometimes red, grown carefully in small garden plots, used root to leaf. Turnip greens boiled into soup. Skins fed the fire. Nothing discarded. Fruit was fleeting apples, wild plums, blackberries, tan, fast or dried for winter. Sugar, unheard of. Honey, if you kept bees, was priceless. Otherwise, your pottage stayed stubbornly savory in the loosest sense of the word. Herbs like parsley, sage, dill, or mint grew where they could, not for flavor, but for medicine, protection, or habit. Some were believed to ward off illness. Others repelled pests. If they made your stew taste slightly less like despair, that was a bonus, not the goal. Meals were shared on benches around the hearth. No courses, no recipes, just a pot, a loaf, and the silent hope that something would remain for tomorrow. You didn't complain. Complaining didn't thicken the stew. On feast days, weddings, harvest festivals, Saints' days you might roast a fowl or bake a pie, but not the flaky, buttery kind. Medieval pies were encased in thick, hard Dua-sealed box meant to preserve the filling, not delight the tongue. If spices were available, pepper, ginger, maybe cinnamon, you used them sparingly, a luxury earned through trade or luck. But most days weren't feasts. Most days were quiet. You scraped your bowl, soaked your bread, drank your ale, and leaned back full enough to last the night, if not exactly satisfied. There was comfort in repetition, knowing the taste of the stew, the weight of the loaf, the hands that stirred the pot by the same fire, night after night. As the wind whispered through the cracks and the animals shifted in their sleep, the stew bubbled, the bread cooled, and once a goon. You owned almost nothing, and yet everything you had was borrowed. Your patch of land, the Lord's, your tools, technically his. Your house, crooked and patched, built on his soil. Even your labor belonged to him. You weren't a slave, but you weren't free either. You were a villain, not an insult, but a legal category, bound to the land, unable to leave without permission, unable to pass your holding to your children without paying for the privilege. You owed labor, goods, and deference, not to a distant king, but to the man who lived up the hill in a house that didn't leak quite so badly. Your relationship with him wasn't personal. You rarely saw him. You spoke instead to the steward, the man with the ledger, the sharp eyes, and the colder heart. He tracked what you owed: grain, wool, chickens, eggs, ale, bacon. If you caught fish, the river belonged to the Lord. Of course it did. You also paid to use what you needed. The mill, owned by the Lord. You paid a fee to grind your grain, and grinding it yourself was often illegal. The communal oven, another fee. Try baking at home, and the steward might find you're worse. It wasn't just about money. It was about control. Even life's milestones came with a price. Want to marry? Pay. Want to inherit your father's plot? Pay. Want to move? Ask permission, then pay. Your livestock, taxed. Your tools, sometimes taxed. Your very ability to exist on this land was leased, not granted. And what did you get in return? In theory, protection. If bandits came, the Lord's men might fight. If famine struck, he might distribute grain from his stores for a price. If your neighbor's goat ate your cabbages, his court could settle it again for a price. This was feudalism, a pyramid of obligation dressed in the robes of loyalty. The manor stood a partifan on higher ground, built of timber or even stone, with thick thatch that kept the wind out. Inside, tapestries, servants, tables laden with food you couldn't name. The Lord wore wool lined with fur and thought little of you. He might not know your face, but he knew your numbers, how much barley you owed, how many eggs you'd promised, whether your son was old enough to add to the labor rolls. Everything was recorded by stewards, reeves, bailiffsmen with wax tablets or scraps of parchment. You couldn't read, so you answered their questions carefully. Say too much, and you'd owe more. Say too little, and you'd be punished. Fail to meet your dues. Fines, confiscated tools, lost land, a ruined house. Resistance wasn't rebellion, it was suicide. And yet the system held. Not because it was just, but because it was predictable. You knew what was expected. Give, 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 day after day, season after season. And occasionally, just occasionally, the Lord gave back. A feast day with extra bread. A holiday without labor. A nod from horseback. Not enough to change your life, but enough to keep you from breaking. You bowed when he passed. Removed your cap. Used the right words, not out of respect, but survival. And maybe, in the quietest part of your heart, you held a sliver of hope that if you worked hard enough, obeyed long enough, prayed loud enough, something might shift. It almost never did, but that whisper of possibility was part of the design. Hope, however, faint, kept the wheel turning. While the steward walked, the reeve wrote, the mill ground, you kept your hands in the soil year after year, with no retirement, no promotion, no escape. Only the quiet certainty that you'd done your part. You'd carried the weight of someone else's title. And as long as the Lord was satisfied, you were allowed to keep breathing. Long before the Black Death blackened Europe's pages, peasants lived in the shadow of sickness. Not the dramatic plague of history books, but the daily, grinding presence of illness. A cut gone septic, a cough that wouldn't quit, a fever that stole your strength overnight. Disease wasn't an event. It was the air you breathed. There were no hospitals. If you were lucky, your village had a wise woman, a midwife, who knew which herbs eased pain, which roots drew out infection. If you were very lucky, a literate monk might pass through, offering prayers and slightly better care than superstition. But mostly, you got sick and you stayed home. You sweated through your clothes. You lay still. You hoped no one knew about germs. Microscopes were centuries away. Instead, they believed in miasma, bad air carrying sickness through stench. So people stuffed herbs in their sleeves, carried nosegays, pressed vinegar-soaked rags to their faces. It didn't help, but it felt like action. Others saw illness as divine punishment. Sin brought fever. Disobedience brought blight. If your child fell ill, it was a test. If your body failed after your crops did, it was your fault or your neighbor's. Local cures abounded. The evil eye. Wear amulet. Moon phases. Burn sage. Sickness entering through the feet. Boil them, then burn your mattress just in case. Treatments were as strange as the theories. Fever, bleed the patient. Swelling, apply a poultice of mashed herbs, mud, or bread. Stomachache, chew charcoal. Coughing, blood. Drink wine with crushed pearls. Blurry eyes. Have someone whisper prayers while blowing smoke over your head. And if your leg turned black, you were already gone. Plague amulets, metal bone, blessed scraps, onions buried in room corners, garlic above doors. One desperate remedy. Tie a live chicken to the infected wound and hope the sickness jumped to the bird. It rarely worked, but hope was scarce, and people clung to anything. Sickness didn't bring rest. You worked until you collapsed. Then your family carried on feeding children, tending animals, while you lay in the corner with broth and murmured prayers. Sometimes you recovered, walking again with a limp and a deeper love for warm soup. Sometimes you didn't. Then a candle was lit. That was all. Plague wasn't always the Black Death. More often, it was dysentery in summer, smallpox in winter, leprosy creeping through the village. Even the common flu could leave half the hamlet bedridden. There were no case counts, just rumors. 3 children died by the river. The cough came from the next valley. You boiled more water, left herbs at thresholds, avoided eye contact, not out of fear but out of knowing. Death wasn't always dreaded, it was recognized. People knew its signs: the slowing breath, the cooling skin, the dulling eyes. Soft prayers were whispered by firelight. When the Black Death finally arrived in the 14th century, it struck with apocalyptic fury, but by then, the world was already intimate with suffering. Life wasn't about avoiding death. It was about enduring long enough to see another harvest, another winter passed, another bowl of pottage shared with those you loved. And in that quiet endurance there was dignity. There was strength. There was humanity. The idea that you could wake up healthy and be buried before sunset wasn't new. It was just happening more often. The plague came in waves each, one fiercer, stranger, more ruthless than the last. Buboes swelled in necks and groins, purple-black and hot to the touch. Fever stole minds before it stole breath. Blood darkened, bubbled, turned the body against itself. People died in days, sometimes in hours. Entire villages emptied not with a scream, but with silence. Fields lay fallow. Church bells tolled too often, then stopped altogether when no one was left to pull the rope. Some tried to run, but disease travels faster than feet, faster than fear. Others fell to their knees, whipping their backs raw, doubling their prayers, swearing to live holy lives if only God would spare them. A few turned violent, hunting scapegoats, strangers, beggars, anyone who looked different, spoke oddly, or carried the wrong kind of silence. They blamed sinners, heretics, the wind itself, anything but the truth that the world had cracked open. And death was pouring through. The church offered explanations, rituals, burial rites, then watched its own ranks crumble. Monks died by the dozen. Priests vanished mid-sentence. In some places, funerals ceased entirely. Bodies were dragged to mass graves, stacked like firewood, often without names, without prayers, without even a pause. And yet, life went on, not with joy, not with hope, but with a bone-deep, exhausted resilience. People learned to live alongside sickness the way they lived with hunger or frost, not by conquering it, but by weaving around it. They swept their thresholds more often, boiled water twice, shared herbs like secrets, whispered new prayers over doorposts and cradles. Some believed surviving one illness granted immunity to the next. Others stopped believing in protection altogether, yet still rose each morning to milk the cow, feed the child, stir the ashes. Children grew up knowing which plants healed and which killed, which leaves soothed fevers, and which roots could mimic bread if boiled long enough to lose their stink. They learned to wrap wounds with clean linen, wait out fevers without flinching, and recognize the moment not with words, but with silence when someone wouldn't recover. That was the real knowledge, when to stop hoping, and still they lived. They married under ash-streaked skies. They harvested what little grew. They shared thin stew and thinner bread. They gathered by the hearth and told stories, not of knights or kings, but of the time old Tomas survived winter fever on nothing but garlic water and sheer spite, and how his granddaughter still adds rosemary to every pot just in case. The plague wasn't the end of the world. It was simply part of it. And for those who endured, survival became resistance, not loud or heroic, but quiet, stubborn, unyielding, a refusal to vanish without witness, a belief that tomorrow might come, and if it didn't, someone would remember your name. Or at least the way you always stirred the broth clockwise. Night in the medieval countryside was never peaceful. It was quiet, the way a cave is quiet, full of creaks, sighs, distant rustles, and the kind of stillness that amplifies the sound of your own heartbeat. The day ended not by choice, but by light. When dusk fell, everything had to be secured in haste, because once darkness swallowed the yard, the world shrank to the size of your hearth. There was no artificial light, not truly. Candles were luxury items, wax too precious to burn for comfort. If you owned a tallow lamp, it stayed dark unless illness struck or a holy vigil demanded it. Most nights, the fire died to embers, their glow the only witness to your rest, and you didn't sleep as we do through the night in one unbroken stretch. Sleep came in two parts. First sleep began soon after dark. You banked the fire, hushed the children, pulled straw-stuffed pallets near the warmth. If you had a mattress, it was lumpy, shared, faintly sour. If not, you slept on woven rushes or bare earth, softened only by habit. Everyone slept together, parents, cousins, servants, elders, not out of affection, but necessity. This single room was the only warm place in the house. On bitter nights, even animals came inside, a goat by the door, chickens in baskets, the dog curled against your back. Warmth trumped privacy. Solitude wasn't comfort, it was punishment, reserved for the mad or the disgraced. You turned to face the wall, stuffed straw in your ears, shared blankets thick with lanolin and age, breathed in the sour sweet smell of sleep, sweat, and stew. Someone always snored. Someone always mumbled in dreams. You learned to tune it out, not as noise, but as proof of life. After a few hours, you woke, not startled, not afraid, but as if your body had known the rhythm all along. This watching hour, often near midnight, was sacred in its stillness. Some prayed, others stirred the coals, or stepped barefoot into the freezing dark to relieve themselves. Lovers whispered, mothers checked on infants, and dreams vivid, urgent floated through this liminal space. Flesh and spirit. Dreams here weren't just images, they were messages. A field of ripe wheat meant abundance. A snake coiled in your lap. Illness, a broken tooth, death. You remembered these dreams. You spoke of them at dawn, not casually, but with weight. The village always had dream readers, not official, never titled, but known. Everyone knew who to ask. Then came second, sleep deeper, slower, heavier. This was the sleep that mended blisters, eased aching joints, blurred the edges of hunger. If you were lucky, it lasted until dawn. If not, you lay still, listening to the house breathe around you, waiting for the first crow to give you permission to rise. The night was never silent. The fire crackled, wind whispered through thatch, a baby whimpered, a cow shifted its weight, and sometimes, most dreadfully, came the wet, rattling cough that never seemed to end. Everyone heard it. No one spoke of it. You didn't need to. The sound said everything. Fear of the dark wasn't superstition, it was survival. Wolves howled close enough to rattle shutters. Thieves crept along field edges. Fires sparked from stray embers. Roofs groaned under snow. And then there were the things you didn't name. Spirits, demons, witches, riding the wind. You didn't speak of them, but you protected against them. Iron nails by the door. The sign of the cross above the hearth. Herbs, rosemary, sage. Rue hung in bundles over thresholds. A red string tied around a child's wrist. You tucked yourself in carefully at night, believing sleep made the soul vulnerable. Mirrors were covered. Beds faced the fire. Feet never pointed toward the door. It invited death in cold was the true enemy. It seeped through walls, under doors, into bones. You didn't sleep naked and dressing, for bed would have seemed absurd. You slept in layers, wool, fur, cloaks, even boots. Warmth was armor. Sleeping together was uncomfortable elbows, knees, the occasional dog fart, but it was human. You heard your father's breath, your daughter's sigh, your grandmother murmuring a psalm in her sleep. It wasn't peaceful, but it was shared. And in that closeness there was security. The church warned that sleep was when the devil whispered, that dreams could be traps. You were taught to pray before bed, to keep your soul ready for tonight might be your last. And it could be. People slipped away in the night, fever rising, breath failing, gone by dawn as if stolen by shadows. That uncertainty gave every morning a quiet reverence. When light returned and the rooster crowed and someone stirred the coals back to life, meant you'd survived. Again, you sat up slowly. Every joint ached, no matter your age. Cold bit your nose. You wiped sleep from your eyes and looked around, counted bodies, checked on those who hadn't stirred. Once the living were confirmed, the day began. Water fetched, bread broken, animals fed. If your dream had weight, you shared it over the pot. Then the night's memory softened, folded into the rhythm of work and worry. In winter, sleep stretched long. In summer, it shortened, but the two-part rhythm held. No clocks, but deep order. And in that rhythm, something honest. You didn't seek comfort. You sought endurance. And if, by grace, you found a quiet night, a warm corner, a dream that didn't haunt you, that wasn't expected, it was a gift. One you accepted without question, knowing it might not come again soon. Some years, you were simply hungry. Other years, you were in famine. There is a difference. Hunger has rules. You stretch, ration, hope. Famine breaks all rules. It's when the fields yield nothing, the root cellar is bare, and next week is a lie you can no longer tell yourself. Food becomes memory, not substance. You saw it coming. In spring, the rains came to Hardor, not at all. Barley sprouted patchy. Beans bloomed, then blackened. Cabbages split open before they swelled. Wheat stalks bowed like mourners. You noticed. Everyone did. No one said it aloud, but eyes met. Calculations ran silently through every mind. How much is left? How much seed must we save? How much can we afford to eat? The cruelest choice came in summer. Plant the last seeds, or grind them into flour. Save for a harvest that may never come, or feed your child one more warm bowl. Portions shrank. Stew thinned. Bread grew smaller. Bowls came back less often, not empty, but lighter. You didn't panic. Not yet. You told yourself this had happened before, that neighboring villages might share, that the manor's granary would open. Hope was still on the table, if nothing else was. By August, denial faded. By September, it drowned. You stopped feeding the animals first. Chickens fell silent. Goats grew hollow-eyed. The dog followed you like it knew it was next. Bread became ritual. One loaf, split 5 ways. Everyone chewed slowly. No one spoke of crusts. Crumbs were swept up like coins. Stew was mostly watercolored only by the pot stains. You boiled weeds, ground roots, ate things you didn't recognize, praying they weren't poison. Some weren't. You didn't sleep through the night not from fear, but from hunger's constant gnawing. Children asked fewer questions. That's how you knew it was real. They didn't beg for honey, didn't ask when bread would return. They sat by the fire and stared, learned how to wait. The village grew quiet. No laughter in lanes, no arguments over sheep, just coughs, wind, the crack of firewood. Famine didn't breed, cruelty it bred, silence. Sometimes someone returned with a rabbit, a handful of acorns, a bird snared at dawn. You chewed it even when it tasted bitter, smiled not because it was good, but because it was something. You tried not to resent the manner. Sometimes they gave grain, sometimes they didn't. The steward stopped coming. That silence spoke louder than any decree. You're on your own. The church did what it could: bread after Mass, shelter for the weakest, but even they were stretched thin. You prayed more not from faith, but because words cost nothing when your hands were too weak to work. Some left the village entirely, walking toward rumor, toward God, toward anything. Some returned. Most didn't. You never asked why. You were too tired. Your body changed. Ribs pressed from within. You stood slowly, as if your bones were fragile, bruised at a touch. Woke, with fists clenched around tools you could no longer lift. Cold bit deeper. The fire became your closest companion. You fed it even as your belly emptied. Heat was the one luxury you could still give yourself. You ate everything: roots, bark, beans boiled thrice, flour swept from floor cracks. You baked bread so hard it cracked your tooth. And when food vanished, you looked to what wasn't food but might be made to pass. Leather, boiled and salted, not nourishing, not kind, but chewable. Once you found a rat. You didn't scream. You thanked God, cooked it alone, told no one. You still feel guilt, but no regret. Dreams grew strange. Feasts on long tables, wine flowing, roast fowl steaming. You woke, chewing your own tongue, dreamed of boiling pots, though you hadn't cooked in days. Dreamed of green shoots in snow, of childhood when hunger was simple, temporary, and some nights you dreamed of being full. You woke crying. The graveyard grew slowly, then fast, then faster than hands could dig. You knew someone had died when the church bell stayed silent. No one left to ring it. Graves grew shallow. Prayers shortened. Mourning went unvoiced. Everyone had their own hunger to bear. Grief was a luxury you couldn't afford. But, like all famines, this one ended not with fanfare, but with rain. Gentle, steady rain. The ground softened. Seeds stirred. Green broke through. Weak, yes, but alive. You had just enough strength left to hope. The first harvest went to children, then elders. You took the smallest bowl, passed it with a smile. And when the first true loaf came from the oven, dark on the bottom, cracked on top, you stared at it before eating. remembered every empty day, every lie you told to spare another's pain. You ate slowly, and for the first time in months, sit filled you. By the time you could walk, the church had already claimed you. It took your name at baptism, anointed your brow with oil you didn't understand, and wove your soul into a tapestry that stretched far beyond your valley, your lifetime, your name. You didn't choose the church. It chose you on, never let go. In the quiet corners of your life, in pre-dawn chill, in storm-lashed nights you felt its presence like gravity. It didn't sit beside your life. It structured it, marking feast days, demanding tithes, forgiving sins, defining salvation. The church wasn't a building you visited. It was the air you breathed, the rhythm of your year, the voice that would one day whisper over your grave, and had been whispering about it since you were born. The village priest, often the only literate person for miles, was more than a shepherd of souls. He was your calendar, your counselor, your link to the divine. He knew why pigs died, why storms came, which saint to invoke for sore teeth. He walked the lanes like a man who held both blessing and judgment in his robes. You brought him your sins in mumbles, hoping his sigh wasn't disappointment. You saw him at birth, marriage, death, the only guaranteed ceremonies of a peasant's life. Between them, he spoke for a God you feared more than you loved, because love, you were taught, required obedience. Mass was spoken in Latina language, as distant as the stars. You stood in the cold nave beside your family, feet numb, listening to words that didn't belong to you, couldn't be yours. You didn't understand what the priest said as he lifted the bread, blessed the wine, spoke to God in a tongue reserved for heaven. But you believed because belief was the only rope you had, and so you bowed your head. You made the sign. You gave your tithe of grain, of wool, of hope. And in return, the church gave you order, meaning, a story in which even your small, muddy life had a place, not a glorious one, not a remembered one, but a sacred one. And sometimes, in the quiet, after the final hymn, as you stepped back into the gray light of your world that was enough, you didn't understand the words the priest spoke as he lifted the bread, but you believed, or tried to. Something invisible had happened. That was the point. The bread was no longer just bread. The wine was no longer just wine. Through murmured Latin and solemn gestures, the divine had slipped into the room, quietly, irrevocably. You didn't speak the words yourself, but they moved through you anyway, like wind through thatch. You mouthed what you could remember, crossed yourself when the others did, bowed your head at the right moments. You learned the rhythm of holiness the way you learned the path to the well, without knowing why each stone turned the way it did, only that you needed the water. And this was water for your soul. The church didn't just mark time, it carved it into sacred fragments. You didn't say March or April. You said after Easter or near St. Michael's. Your year was shaped not by months, but by mysteries. Lent's long fast, Advent's hushed, waiting, Epiphanies. All Saints crowded heaven. The church told you when to feast and when to starve your hunger into prayer. 40 days without meat before Easter, then a feast so rich it made your head spin. Fridays meant fish, even if you lived miles from any river. The wealthy drank almond milk, sweet and pale. You made do with turnips and cold broth. On saints' days, you shared what little you had. On fast days, You dreamed of what you couldn't have. Even when your bowl was empty, your plate overflowed with rules. And those rules cost you, because your calendar wasn't just for devotion, it was for payment. The church took its tenth, the tithe, from everything: grain, wool, eggs, chickens, cider, whatever your hands coaxed from the earth or your body brought into the world. A portion belonged to God. That's what they told you, though God never came to collect it. The priest did, or the steward, with his ledger and his quiet eyes that missed nothing. You watched your best barley golden, heavy, hard-earned, loaded onto carts and hauled to the tithe barn, a structure always larger than your home. You saw neighbors hand over their last sack of oats while the priest murmured prayers for mercy they'd just paid for in kind. And when the harvest failed, when rains came too late or frost struck too early, the demand never softened. You owed what you owed, always. Sometimes they let you pay in candles, labor, or days spent weeding the church garden. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes the debt settled on your shoulders like a yoke you couldn't shrug off even when you stood perfectly straight. But the church didn't only take, it also gave, though rarely in the form you wished for. It gave you stories to explain the unexplainable, structure to hold the chaos, reasons where there were none. When your cow collapsed without warning, the priest named a saint to pray to. When your child burned with fever, he offered explanations, a test of faith, punishment for hidden sin, or the devil slipping through a crack in your belief. He handed you blessings, like bread, small, dry, but sacred. Told you to light a candle, visit a shrine where a scrap of cloth rubbed against a relic. Sometimes that relic was a bone, a tooth, a sliver of wood, a ribbon said to be soaked in the blood of a martyr long forgotten. You held it like treasure, pressed it to your child's forehead, tucked it under your pillow. Sometimes it seemed to work. Sometimes it didn't. But even when it failed, it was better than standing alone in the dark with nothing but your fear. There was a saint for everything. Sant Apollonia, 4 Toothachches. Isidore, for plowing straight rows. Saint Sebastian, for plague. You didn't know where they were buried or when they'd walked the earth. You only knew their names and what they could fix. Their stories lived in flickering firelight, passed from grandparent to child, half memory, half magic. No one was sure where truth ended and legend began, but it didn't matter. You called on them when you had nothing else, whispered their names as you stirred the thin stew, muttered them while kneeling in mud to plant seeds you weren't sure would grow. You struck quiet bargains. I'll fast for a week. I'll bake an extra loaf. I'll walk to the shrine on bare feet. Few, just help me this once. And sometimes, just sometimes, it felt like they listened, or maybe it was hope wearing a saint's name. Either way, it was enough to ask again. Pilgrimage was a holy act, but also an escape. For a few days, you stepped beyond the 5-mile circle that had contained your entire life. You walked roads you'd never seen, toward shrines you'd only heard of in hushed tones. You carried your prayers like baggage strapped to your back, clutched in your palm, worn into your boots. You slept under hedges, in barn corners, beside strangers who shared their bread without asking your name. You arrived, footsore, voice hoarse, heart raw. You stood before a sliver of bone in a glass case. or a statue blackened by centuries of candle smoke, and prayed that something inside you would shift. Sometimes it did, not always healing, but changing. You returned, thinner, quieter, maybe no richer, but different, as if the road had scraped something off you, or poured something in. You brought back a shell, a cloth, a story, and for weeks after, your neighbors listened when you spoke, as if holiness clung to your words like dust. Because, in a world where so little was yours, your land, your labor, even your children's futures, the one thing you could own was your faith. Not because it promised riches or ease, but because it let you mean something. In the grand design of God and King and Lord, your life was small, muddy, brief, unrecorded, but the church gave you a place in the story, not at the center, never at the center, but somewhere. And for many, that was enough, enough to kneel, enough to give, enough to keep walking even when the road led only home. Even death was a ritual not yours to shape, but choreographed by the church. When you felt the end near, you sent for the priest. He came with oil and Latin, with hands that had touched 1,000 foreheads before yours. He anointed you, murmured prayers over your cooling body, and tried to guide your soul through the narrow gate ahead. Your family gathered in the single room where you'd laughed, argued, birthed, and bled. Candles were lit sparingly, reverently. If someone still had the strength, the church bell tolled once, twice, then fell silent. You were buried on consecrated ground, beside generations who'd walked the same mud, carried the same burdens, whispered the same prayers. And then began the afterlife of the dead, the masses. Your kin paid what they could bread if they were poor, coin if they weren't, for candles to burn, for your name to be spoken in the litany of saints and sinners. Because even in death there were debts. The church taught that heaven wasn't a door you simply walked through. Your soul might linger in purgatory, a shadowed corridor, between fire and grace, waiting years, centuries, until someone pulled you free. And so they prayed. They gave. The poor offered loaves. The wealthy gave land, all to shorten a sentence in a place no one had seen but everyone feared. Fear, after all, was part of the church's gift, not cruelty, but control. It gave answers where there were none. It told you why the rains failed, why your child never woke, why the plague spared the cruel and took the kind. Suffering had meaning. Obedience had reward. Even chaos had order for you, believed, and you did. Not always with joy, but with necessity. You never truly questioned the church's power. You might grumble about the tithe. You might curse under your breath when the priest ignored your plea. But you never stopped showing up. You still knelt. You still crossed yourself when the bell rang. Because if the church was wrong, if God wasn't listening, if saints didn't hear, if purgatory was just a story, then the world had no shape at all. And a shapeless world was unbearable, even when the priest drank too much, even when the bishop demanded more than your bones could bear, even when a seller of indulgences rolled into town with a cart of promises and a purse already heavy with other people's hope. You still believed, or you acted like you did, and in the end, that was the same thing. Belief wasn't about what you thought in your heart. It was about what you did with your hands, lighting candles, bowing your head, giving your tenth. You didn't understand the Latin, but you understood the structure, and you stayed inside it because it was the only path forward. When you died, you hoped the candles would burn long enough, that your name would be spoken often enough to matter, that the saints still listened, that your sins had been weighed and forgiven in equal measure, and that the church, with all its dust, gold, weight, and mystery, would carry you the rest of the way. You might think that after all they endured plague, tithes, taxes, the boot of the Lord, the silence of the sky, they would have risen up, that centuries of grinding hardship would have built a pressure so great it shattered the walls of their villages one frost-awed morning. Mass was spoken in Latin, a language as distant as the stars. You stood in the cold nave beside your family, feet numb, listening to words that didn't belong to you, couldn't be yours. You didn't understand what the priest said as he lifted the bread, blessed the wine, spoke to God in a tongue reserved for heaven, but you believed because belief was the only rope you had. And so you bowed your head, you made the sign. You gave your tithe of grain, of wool, of hope, and in return the church gave you order, meaning a story in which even your small, muddy life had a place, not a glorious one, not a remembered one, but a sacred one. And sometimes, in the quiet after the final hymn, as you stepped back into the gray light of your world, that was enough. You didn't understand the words the priest spoke as he lifted the bread, but you believed, or tried to. Something invisible had happened. That was the point. The bread was no longer just bread. The wine was no longer just wine. Through murmured Latin and solemn gestures, the divine had slipped into the room, quietly, invisibly, irrevocably. You didn't speak the words yourself, but they moved through you anyway, like wind through thatch. You mouthed what you could remember, crossed yourself when the others did, bowed your head. You learned the rhythm of holiness, the way you learned the path to the well, without knowing why each stone turned the way it did, only that you needed the water. And this was water for your soul. The church didn't just mark, time it, carved it into sacred fragments. You didn't say March or April. You said after Easter or near St. Michael's. Your year was shaped not by months, but by mysteries. Lent's long fast, Advent's hushed waiting, Epiphanies, starlight. All saints crowded heaven. The church told you when to feast and when to starve your hunger into prayer. 40 days without meat before Easter, then a feast so rich it made your head spin. Fridays meant fish, even if you lived miles from any river. The wealthy drank almond milk, sweet and pale. You made do with turnips and cold broth. On saints' days, you shared what little you had. On fast days, you dreamed of what you couldn't have. Even when your bowl was empty, your plate overflowed with rules, and those rules cost you, because your calendar wasn't just for devotion, it was for payment. The church took its tenth, the tithe, from everything: grain, wool, eggs, chickens, cider, whatever your hands coaxed from the earth, or your body brought into the world. A portion belonged to God. That's what they told you. Though God never came to collect it, the priest did, or the steward with his ledger and his quiet eyes that missed nothing. You watched your best barley golden, heavy, hard-earned, loaded onto carts and hauled to the tithe barn, a structure always larger than your home. You saw neighbors hand over their last sack of oats, while the priest murmured prayers for mercy they'd just paid for in kind. And when the harvest failed, when rains came too late or frost struck too early, the demand never softened. You owed what you owed, always. Sometimes they let you pay in candles, labor, or days spent weeding the church garden. Sometimes they didn't. Sometimes the debt settled on your shoulders like a yoke you couldn't shrug off even when you stood perfectly straight. But the church didn't only take. It also gave, though rarely in the form you wished for. It gave you stories to explain the unexplainable, structure to hold the chaos, reasons where there were none. When your cow collapsed without warning, the priest named a saint to pray to. When your child burned with fever, he offered explanations, a test of faith, punishment for hidden sin, or the devil slipping through a crack in your belief. He handed you blessings like breads, small, dry, but sacred, told you to light a candle, visit a shrine, where a scrap of cloth rubbed against a relic. Sometimes that relic was a bone, a tooth, a sliver of wood, a ribbon said to be soaked in the blood of a martyr long forgotten. You held it like treasure, pressed it to your child's forehead, tucked it under your pillow. Sometimes it seemed to work, sometimes it didn't, but even when it failed, it was better than standing alone in the dark with nothing but your fear. There was a saint for everything. St. Apollonia, 4Toothes. Isidore, for plowing straight rows. Saint Sebastian for plague. You didn't know where they were buried or when they'd walked the earth. You only knew their names and what they could fix. Their stories lived in flickering firelight, passed from grandparent to child, half memory, half magic. No one was sure where truth ended and legend began, but it didn't matter. You called on them when you had nothing else, whispered their names as you stirred the thin stew, muttered them while kneeling in mud to plant seeds you weren't sure would grow. You struck quiet bargains. I'll fast for a week. I'll bake an extra loaf. I'll walk to the shrine on bare feet if you just help me this once. And sometimes, just sometimes, it felt like they listened. Or maybe it was hope wearing a saint's name. Either way, it was enough to ask again. Pilgrimage was a holy act, but also an escape. For a few days, you stepped beyond the 5-mile circle that had contained your entire life. You walked roads you'd never seen, toward shrines you'd only heard of in hushed tones. You carried your prayers like baggage strapped to your back, clutched in your palm, worn into your boots. You slept under hedges, in barn corners, beside strangers who shared their bread without asking your name. You arrived footsore, voice hoarse, heart raw. You stood before a sliver of bone in a glass case, or a statue blackened by centuries of candle smoke, and hoped, prayed, that something inside you would shift. Sometimes it did, not always healing, but changing. You returned, thinner, quieter, maybe no Richard, but different, as if the road had scraped something off you, or poured something in. You brought back a shell, a cloth, a story, and for weeks after, your neighbors listened when you spoke, as if holiness clung to your words like dust. Because in a world where so little was yours, your land, your labor, even your children's futures, the one thing you could own was your faith. Not because it promised riches or ease, but because it let you mean something. In the grand design of God and King and Lord, your life was small, muddy, brief, unrecorded, but the church gave you a place in the story, not at the center, never at the center, but somewhere. And for many, that was enough. Enough to kneel, enough to give, enough to keep walking even when the road led only home. Even death was a ritual, not yours to shape, but choreographed by the church. When you felt the end near, you sent for the priest. He came with oil and Latin, with hands that had touched 1,000 foreheads before yours. He anointed you, murmured prayers over your cooling body, and tried to guide your soul through the narrow gate ahead. Your family gathered in the single room where you'd laughed, argued, birthed, and bled. Candles were lit sparingly, reverently. If someone still had the strength, the church bell tolled once, twice, then fell silent. You were buried on consecrated ground, beside generations who'd walked the same mud, carried the same burdens, whispered the same prayers. And then began the afterlife of the dead, the masses. Your kin paid what they could, bread if they were poor, coin if they weren't, for candles to burn, for your name to be spoken in the litany of saints and sinners, because even in death there were debts. The church taught that heaven wasn't a door you simply walked through. Your soul might linger in purgatoria shadowed corridor, between fire and grace waiting, years, centuries, until someone pulled you free. And so they prayed. They gave, the poor offered loaves. The wealthy gave land, all to shorten a sentence in a place no one had seen but everyone feared. Fear, after all, was part of the church's gift, not cruelty, but control. It gave answers where there were none. It told you why the rains failed, why your child never woke, why the plague spared the cruel and took the kind. Suffering had meaning. Obedience had reward. Even chaos had order if you believed, and you did. Not always with joy, but with necessity. You never truly questioned the church's power. You might grumble about the tithe. You might curse under your breath when the priest ignored your plea. But you never stopped showing up. You still knelt. You still crossed yourself when the bell rang. Because if the church was wrong, if God wasn't listening, if saints didn't hear, if purgatory was just a story, then the world had no shape at all. And a shapeless world was unbearable, even when the priest drank too much, even when the bishop demanded more than your bones could bear, even when a seller of indulgences rolled into town with a cart of promises and a purse already heavy with other people's hope. You still believed, or you acted like you did. And in the end, that was the same thing. Belief wasn't about what you thought in your heart. It was about what you did with your hands, lighting candles, bowing your head, giving your tenth. You didn't understand the Latin, but you understood the structure. And you stayed inside it because it was the only path forward. When you died, you hoped the candles would burn long enough, that your name would be spoken often enough to matter, that the saints still listened, that your sins had been weighed and forgiven in equal measure, and that the church, with all its dust, gold, weight, and mystery, would carry you the rest of the way. The truth is, the system endured, not because it was fair, kind, or efficient, but because it was ancient. It had sunk into the bones of the land, woven into the habits of fathers, grandfathers. You didn't question it. You were born into owing, labor to the Lord, grain to the steward, a tenth to the church, silence to the reeve. And unless fortune smiled unusually wide, you died, still owing. But within those walls, you could survive. Barely, but you could step outside, and the cost was ruin. The manor had soldiers. The church had excommunication, a sentence worse than death, casting you out of community, sacrament, memory. The king didn't know your name, but his laws bound you like rope. Defiance might not bring the gallows. Sometimes it brought banishment, starvation. Your children left to pay the debt you tried to escape. Everyone knew the stories. A father dragged away. A cousin who vanished after refusing to tithe. These tales weren't told to inspire rebellion. They were told to prevent it. And rebellion felt impossible, not just because of fear, but because your world was knit tight with kinship. The people around you weren't strangers. They were your neighbors, your in-laws, the hands that helped you rebuild your fence after the storm. You might despise the steward, but his daughter might marry your son. You might resent the tithe, but you still carried bread to Sunday Mass. The village wasn't just a place. It was your web. Tear it apart, and you tore yourself apart. To revolt against the manor was, in some quiet way, to revolt against your own life. Centuries later, it's easy to paint the peasant as eternally bowed, hat in hand, eyes downcast. But that image misses the truth. Their submission wasn't servitude. It was strategy. They didn't just suffer. They adapted. They bartered. They bent. They found cracks in the walls and built homes. In the spaces between the rules, a pig hidden from the tax count, an extra sack of rye buried beneath the hearth, a bribe paid in eggs instead of coin. These were the rebellions they could afford, practical, invisible, effective. They weren't driven by ideology, but by weather. Their question wasn't what is just, but will this feed us through winter? Justice was a luxury they didn't trust. Lords changed. Priests came and went. But the soil still needed turning. Children still cried from hunger. You didn't revolt against that. You endured it, and the church. It was perhaps the most powerful force of all, not through soldiers, but through story. It taught that suffering was holy, that endurance was virtue, that the meek would inherit the earth, though it never said when. Your trials weren't punishment, they were purification. Your reward wasn't here. It was beyond the grave, and if heaven felt distant, hell loomed close. Fire, torment, gnashing teeth, waiting for the proud, the defiant, the ones who said no. Yet the peasants weren't passive. Their resistance was simply quieter. They gossiped about the steward's limp, sang Bodhi songs about the Lord's secret trysts, laughed when the priest tripped over Latin at night by the fire. They told stories of better days, of kings who listened, of harvests that never failed, of a world where your back didn't ache by 30. They found dignity in small acts, sharing a crust with a widow, tending a field just slightly outside the prescribed rows, staying silent when silence protected someone you loved. Their rebellion wasn't in banners, it was in breath, in persistence, in the stubborn act of surviving despite. Sometimes things changed, but from above. A kinder Lord, a forgiving bishop, a storm that reminded the powerful they, too, were mortal. The peasant's role wasn't to demand change. It was to wait, to endure, to hand down what little they had donned, teach their children when to be quiet, and when, just once in a while, to be brave. And yes, they dreamed. Of course they did. Not of revolution, perhaps, but of relief. A world where no one knocked on your door with a ledger, where your child wouldn't inherit your ache, where you could sleep without fear of wolves, soldiers, or winter's bite. These dreams didn't promise to come true. They just kept you alive. What's truly astonishing isn't that peasants revolted so rarely, it's that they kept their culture, their faith, their families whole under such weight. They preserved songs no one wrote down, passed healing knowledge from mother to daughter, remembered which roots eased fever, which herbs warded evil. They taught each other how to birth, how to mourn, how to pray. They created a continuity that outlasted crusades, kings, and cathedrals. Not with swords, but with spoons. Not with speeches, but with silence. Not with glory, but with grit. Persistence was their rebellion when the manner demanded too much. They survived anyway. When the church taxed their sins, they still lit candles when the world turned cold. They huddled close and waited for spring. The fields may have belonged to someone else, but the soil remembered their hands. Revolution, as later centuries would know it, didn't live in them. No fiery speeches, no printed manifestos. But there was a different kind of strength, a kind that endures hardship without becoming hard, that kneels not from weakness, but because it knows it can rise again tomorrow. That too is resistance. And so they endured without monuments, without ballads, without names in history books. They endured in the rhythm of the plow at dawn, in the smoke curling from cottage chimneys at dusk, in lullabies hummed over dying fires, in stories whispered to children who would one day whisper them back. History may forget them, folding their lives into footnotes beneath crowns and conquests, but the peasants were the thread that held the whole tapestry together. Without them, there would be no harvests to feed armies, no stone to build cathedrals, no world for kings to rule. They built everything and owned nothing. They may not have toppled their lords, but they outlasted them, and maybe that is revolution enough. They may not have worn crowns or signed treaties. They left no statues. No grand speeches echo their names, but look closely and you'll see them everywhere in the curve of a plowed field at dawn, stubborn green of a barley shoot pushing through, frost in the smoke that still curls from cottage chimneys, in forgotten valleys in the lullaby, hummed by a mother who doesn't know she's singing a song 500 years old. The peasants changed the world with fire and fury. They held it together with calloused hands, shared bread, and the quiet certainty that someone had to plant the seeds. Even when the sky offered no promise of rain, they were told their lives were small, but small things hold the earth in place. Their rebellion wasn't in the clash of swords, it was in the refusal to disappear, not in shouting no, but in whispering not yet, not in tearing down walls, but in slipping through the cracks. Again and again, with a sack of grain, a saved piglet, a child tucked safely behind the door, and when the last lord's name faded from memory, when the last bishop's decree turned to dust, the soil still bore the imprint of their feet. The rivers still carried the echo of their songs. The stars they prayed under, they still watch over us. So the next time you walk through a field, or smell wood smoke on a cold evening, or taste bread that's rough and real, remember them, not as victims, not as shadows, but as witnesses, as keepers, as the quiet architects of survival. They didn't dream of changing history, they just refused to let it erase them. And in that refusal, in that daily, dogged act of staying alive, they carved something eternal into the mud, the marrow, The memory of this world, they are gone, but they are not forgotten, because as long as someone tends the land, shares the last crust, or whispers a prayer in the dark, they are still here, still holding the world together. One breath, one seed, one stubborn, silent act of courage at a time.